Hello and welcome. My name is Teresa and I'm a Field Services Program Manager with the Iowa Soybean Association. And today we're going to be talking about when you should terminate your cover crops. Okay, so to start off with here, I thought we'd go over just briefly some of the benefits of using cover crops. So cover crops generally are known to enhance your soil structure. So that includes greater aggregate stability as well as better water infiltration for when we get a rain event. We know cover crops can also increase your soil organic matter over time, which is good for a number of reasons, including nutrient cycling. Cover crops can also help you reduce erosion and nutrient loss, which is good not only for the environment, but for your soil as well. And finally, when used correctly, cover crops can be a tool to improve your pest management, both weeds and critters. So just generally, those are some of the reasons we try to continue to make cover crops work in Iowa. However, one of the nuances that we don't talk about as much is that how much cover crop growth you get is going to affect how many of those benefits you get and how quickly you get them, right? So I've made a kind of a hypothetical graph over here where we've got, cover crop biomass versus benefits. So just generally, we know that soil benefits are pretty much just going to keep increasing with the amount of cover crop biomass that you get. However, crop yield is not quite on that same trajectory, right? So there's going to be, increasing benefits up to a point, and then after that, there's going to be, too much biomass, and there's going to be some yield drag and some competition in most scenarios. So our goal is to kind of figure out how to get into the sweet spot in the middle where we're getting kind of that maximum crop benefits without giving up any yield so that we can get the most soil benefits that we can out of the practice. Okay, so before we get into our trial results, I wanted to first talk about, what should be on your mind when you're kind of planning your cover crop game plan and thinking about when you should terminate. So first and foremost, we want to get good cover crop establishment. So that means getting it planted in a timely manner and, trying to get the biggest growing window that you can so that you've got, more options in the spring for getting that certain amount of biomass. So some studies have shown that you need kind of a threshold of about 1,000 pounds of biomass per acre, which is generally about 6 to 8 inches tall for your cover crop in order to kind of get to that threshold where you're going to be making a difference with soil erosion and nutrient loss. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking of your growing window for the cover crop. Next thing we want to think about is what are your goals, right? We want to be managing consistent with what our goals are. So for example, if your goal is to try to eliminate an herbicide pass with your cover crop biomass, you're going to need a lot more biomass than say someone whose goal is just, I want to reduce erosion and hang on to my soil. So keep that goal, front of mind when you're coming up with your plan. And then the trickiest part of kind of thinking about your cover crop and when you should terminate is balancing with your cash crop and monitoring the weather and the field conditions in real time. So, there's going to be some game time decisions getting made here. So if we're having, for example, a really dry spring and you're concerned about moisture, you're going to generally want to terminate a little bit earlier to be on the safe side and make sure there's not competition for moisture with your cash crop. If we're having a really wet spring, on the other hand, you might want to let those covers go a little bit longer because they're going to help dry out the field so that you can get in there to plant a little bit earlier. Another thing we need to think about is planting conditions and the timing of planting and termination. So things to think about here, what state is your cover crop going to be in when you plant? So planting green is okay. Planting into a totally brown and desiccated cover crop is okay. But if it's somewhere in the middle there where it's still kind of breaking down and it's still a little bit green, but not all the way dead, that's where you're going to have issues and you're going to, run into problems getting your planter kind of tangled up in that mess. So kind of make sure it's one or the other. And then also you need to have a general kind of plan for how to deal with planting into the residue, especially if you've never done it before. So you need to, make sure you've got the right combination of, row cleaners, downforce pressure, make sure you've got the right closing wheels, and make sure your planting depth is adjusted if it needs to be. So make sure you take time at the beginning to really make sure everything is right, and you check on your planting depth consistently to make sure we're not going to have seeds getting planted too shallowly, or seed trenches not getting closed. Okay, and then finally, got to make sure that you're adjusting your non-cover crop management. So the biggest example here is if you're planting corn after rye, you have to put a higher percent of nitrogen up front. Okay, so we're talking like 30 to 50% of your nitrogen for that corn crop should be either, pre-plant, starter, early side dress, some combination therein. Okay, you don't have to put more nitrogen on total, just a higher percentage has to be upfront. Okay, so this is all to say that we have been trying to find out, where do these things all come together in order to give us the most benefit for this practice. And so one way that we're trying to figure that out is doing trials on cover crop termination. So now we'll dig into some of those results. Okay, so here we have our results for the corn trials, and these span from 2018 to 2021. And the way this is laid out, we've got yield on the y-axis, and then along the x-axis, we've got the termination date, and we've also got the planting date as kind of the free-floating dot. So let's take a look at this trial down here in the bottom left corner. So this is all one trial, and on the left, we've got the early terminated date on April 1st, and then we've got the late terminated date on April 27th, and then that dot in the middle is going to be the planting date. So that's how all of these are kind of set up. So you can see generally with these corn trials, we're comparing one termination date before planting to one termination date either just after planting or maybe like a week after planting. And while none of these results are significantly different between the two termination dates, we do see a general trend of a few bushels lower yield on those later termination dates. So here I've got that same graph, but I put the difference in yield on the later termination date. So you can see most of these, it's a couple bushels less than the earlier terminated treatment. Although this one down on the bottom left that we were looking at earlier, there was actually a yield advantage for waiting a little bit longer. So we also did some biomass collection on these trials as well. Unfortunately for the corn, we were only able to get 2 different trials sampled for biomass. So the colors match with on the graph. So this one goes with this one, and then the pink goes with the pink. And as we can see here, waiting that extra 16 to 26 days did give us about 750 or 500 extra pounds of biomass per acre, which gets us a lot closer to that 1,000 pounds of biomass. That's kind of the threshold for, really getting the advantages that cover crops have to offer. So, and then when we compare that with the yield differences, we have either, 3 bushels less or 3 bushels more. And since these results aren't statistically significant, that's really just noise, in my opinion. So it certainly looks like waiting a couple days in those 2 trials at least may have been worth it. Okay, so now we'll look at the same thing for our soybean trials. So these ones are a little bit harder to look at, but just bear with me here. So you'll notice that some of these trials have planting dates that were before either of the 2 termination dates. So let's take this one, for example, up top, this kind of greenish color. This one was planted, way back here, mid-April, and then the first termination date was May 15th, and the second termination date was close to mid-June. Okay, so some of these we're looking at kind of apples and oranges of much later termination versus, termination that's a lot closer to planting. Oh, yep, here we go. Early termination, late termination, and the planting date there. And again, you'll notice similarly to the corn trials, most of these on the later termination dates, we're seeing lower yields than on the early termination dates. I do want to give a special shout out to this blue trial here in the middle going in the other direction. What happened here was that late frost on Memorial Day. The later terminated date was still green and standing when that hit, and the earlier termination date was already starting to break down. So that's why we see that difference there. The later termination date was protected from the frost. So just wanted to point that one out. Okay, so now here is the biomass results for these soybean trials, and kind of a large range in biomass differences here. And you'll see Some of these, the early termination date was already kind of well past that 1,000 pounds per acre threshold that we're looking for. And I think if you kind of stare at this graph long enough, you'll see that, some of these trials really probably would have fared better if they had terminated everything at the early date. So they did the hard work for us of kind of figuring out where that upper limit of, biomass results to, yield results is. So, okay, the last data set that I want to show you is some Practical Farmers of Iowa trials. So they've been doing, some cover crop termination work as well, and I just wanted to kind of share some of their results with you. So similarly to us, again, we're seeing, a little bit of yield hit for those later termination dates. They were working with a lot more cover crop biomass generally than our trials were. It's pretty impressive that they're getting up into, 4,000, 6,000 pounds of biomass and only seeing, a couple bushels difference. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that other people are kind of seeing these similar trends as well. Okay, so now I'll give you some general kind of conclusions and recommendations here for what we would recommend. If you're going into corn, we would say aim for probably no more than 6 to 8 inches, especially if you're just starting out with cover crops. Consider the planting conditions and the weather more than a strict number of days before or after planting. So generally you want to be planting into warm and dry conditions, warm enough weather for your herbicide to effectively kill the cover crop. And again, when you're planting, you don't want to be planting into any half-dead cover crops. So kind of monitor things as you go and try to pick a date where, all of these goals are going to be met. And then again, for corn, I'll just say it one more time, make sure you're putting a greater amount of your nitrogen up front if you're going behind rye, same total amount of nitrogen. And then for soy, there's a lot more wiggle room than there is for corn. I think we've kind of shown, and other people have shown, that you can really get away with planting your soybeans green and then terminating within a few days, maybe a week after planting, and that you're not going to see a yield hit unless something crazy goes wrong. So I think it's a pretty safe bet at this point. And then again, biomass, I would say that's more to your confidence level. Again, if you're just starting out, maybe, don't go higher than that 6 to 8 inches. But if you've been doing cover crops for a couple of years and you're confident in your ability to plant into higher amounts of residue, I think you can get away with a lot more biomass going into soy than you can in corn. Okay, so that's all I have for you. If you're interested in doing some of these trials on your own farm, please feel free to reach out to us. I put the link to the website up in this slide. We'd love to work with you, so don't be a stranger. Thanks for watching. Bye.